Good evening. It's good to be back tonight. Just a couple of housekeeping things. I was in Adamsville, Tennessee this past Wednesday evening with a guy by the name of Van Sant, and he says to tell everyone hello. He was disappointed that I did not have a PowerPoint, and so to honor him, I don't have one for tonight. I just didn't get it done. But I thought that was funny. He said, "Do you not use PowerPoint all the time at Leoma?" And I said, "No, I don't." And he said, "Boy, they about made me when I was there." I said, "Whew, I'm glad they've softened up since you was there, you know." But anyway, I preached or taught a class Wednesday night without a PowerPoint, and we survived, all of us, including Van. But it was good to be with he and Marianne, and they said to tell you hello. And the other thing is, and maybe you noticed in your bulletin, but I want to publicly let you know that Vacation Bible School has been moved back 2 weeks. It'll be July the 23rd through the 26th. Now, all of those that are directly involved, at least to some degree, have been notified of this change. And it's just a lot of conflicts in the beginning of July with the 4th of July and the kids gone to Horizons. And so the thought was maybe we get it at the end of the summer, and maybe all vacations and things are concluded by that point, and school will be almost getting ready to start. So if you have a desire to be involved in VBS and you have it on your calendar, you need to change the dates to 2 weeks later. That'll be July the 23rd through the 26th this year. And I don't know, that may be where it ends up every year, but at least for this year, we're going to move it back and see if that works better. So please make note of that. Tonight we are in deacons. Talking about deacons. And we've said a lot about deacons. We've looked at deacons. We've went through the things that were read in 1 Timothy chapter 3 there as Paul is writing to Timothy about deacons and about what God desires for them. And you know, it's interesting that as we go to trying to look for examples, if you will, or some type of biblical teaching or some type of apostolic example to follow, a guideline, if you will, or some type of procedure, we're really limited to Acts chapter 6. And there's really, there's really not any elders that I find in there and in terms of how that's set up. And so, we have things in Acts chapter 6 like the apostles are not wanting to cause the spiritual work of the church to be hindered in any way, and so they're saying, search out from among you men, and they give some desires for these men, and basically we come to the end of the day and we say, deacons are appointed in the Lord's church to serve tables, and we gather that from Acts chapter 6, because I don't know where else we would get it from, and so we began to try to separate maybe elders from deacons, and we try to be able to distinguish, and we really get into some difficulties trying to get all of this hashed out, just clear cut, because when we look at Acts chapter 6 and we think about the importance of spiritual things, and then we think about the serving of tables, we know the widows were being neglected there. We know that is a physical thing in nature. And so we just come to this conclusion that elders kind of see to the spiritual things of the church, which isn't entirely true. Because elders see to physical things as well. And I'm not going to be the one to stand here and condemn them for seeing to physical things. They certainly see to some spiritual things, absolutely. And then we get this idea that, deacons are to deal with the physical things of the congregation. And I would be in terrible trouble if I said, deacons, they just deal with physical stuff. That's all they do. Well, I know better than that. I know we have some deacons that are very spiritual men that counsel and that advise, and that some of you go to them and talk to them and look for their wisdom, and you want to talk, and so and these are spiritual things in nature. And so I guess I'm struggling tonight with trying to clear cut this thing and say, well, we need the elders just dealing with spiritual things, and we need the deacons just dealing with physical things. And then as I was reminded this week reading an article written by David Shannon, he was talking about deacons and has talked a lot on deacons and done a lot of study. And his comment was this. He said, congregations need to be careful not to make deacons nothing more than errand boys. Because far too often we've been guilty of that. Go do this or go do that, or we need to appoint a deacon because nobody else wants to take care of this, and we need someone that we can put this on their shoulders because nobody else wants to do it, and we really don't want to do it either. So deacons become nothing more than glorified gophers, or to cover the things that nobody else wants to cover, and the Bible doesn't present them that way at all. And so it's just I'm not saying they are here, I'm just saying it's a word of caution. It can be easy for us to, who are we going to get to do that? Well, let's just get one of the deacons. We need to be careful with that attitude, because what we're trying to do is pass the responsibility so that we don't have it. And we as in members, and we certainly don't want the elders just passing responsibility because they don't want it. And so it's not a middle man, it's not a catch-all man. It is a spiritual leader. God had some spiritual desires for these guys. And they are appointed while their works may be more physical in nature, in terms of buildings and grounds and maintenance and things like that. Somebody's got to be in charge of those things. We must be careful that we don't overlook or degrade what seems to me to be an appointment in the New Testament church that is very spiritual, that is very important, that is very godly in the eyes of God. But now here's what I also know. I also know that the word deacon comes from the Greek word diakonos. And that word is translated minister. It's translated servant. It's translated deacon. And so I love this statement. And you've made it, because I have too. So I'm going to go ahead and accuse us all, okay? I love this statement. Deacons are nothing more than servants. Well, I love that statement. You know what you've just said? You're not. Well, that makes you look real good, doesn't it? If you're not a deacon, then you're saying, well, deacons are nothing more than servants. Well, what are you? Who are you supposed to be? My point is that you're exactly right. Deacons are, you're close to right, rather. Deacons are servants. But so is all of us. So are elders. Elders are servants. And I understand what we mean is that it comes from the word translated servant. So I don't have a nice fancy PowerPoint tonight. I'm going to put you to work. All right? You ready? Let's go to 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. Let's look at several times this word comes up in our New Testament. And then the lesson's yours. I just wanted to show you that it is in fact used different. And so we do need to study the context and realize how the word is being translated or how the word's being used. It's often translated the same exact way. So 1 Thessalonians chapter 3 is where I'm at, and I'm in verse 2. Paul is telling the Thessalonian brethren there in verse 1, we could bear it no longer. We were willing to be left behind at Athens alone. So here's what we did. We sent Timothy to you, our brother, and maybe your Bible says, and God's minister. English Standard Version says God's co-worker. The word translated there, minister, in reference to Timothy, is the word diakonos. That's translated servant, deacon. But now we're not going to call Timothy a deacon, are we? We don't understand Timothy's role to be in a position of being a deacon in the New Testament church as we think about deacons. We obviously understand Timothy to be a servant, as we all are. That word's pretty generic there. But notice here this idea, and I don't know why they've chosen to translate it co-worker, other than to say that Paul and Timothy are working together, and Paul is acknowledging that, and they're working together in the same role, and the role is ministering to the brethren. And so, Timothy is serving. We often call Timothy a minister or an evangelist. I'm not saying that ministers can't be deacons or can't be elders, because I know of some that are both. I'm just saying that in 1 Thessalonians 3 and verse 2, there is a specific context here and something that Paul has in mind when he says, we stayed in Athens, but we sent Timothy to you as a minister of the gospel. But the word used there is the word servant. It's the word deacon. But perhaps best translated in this context as co-worker, or as the King James, minister. A minister of God. We go back to Romans chapter 15. Romans chapter 15. And verse 4. I'm sorry, verse 8. Romans chapter 15 and verse 8. For I tell you that Christ became a servant. Now there's your word. You ever heard anybody call Jesus a deacon? I would venture to say not. Well, we don't think of Jesus in the terms of a deacon in the New Testament church. But there's the word. There's the word from which we get our word deacon, and yet we understand very clearly there's a context here in which Jesus is not being referred to as a deacon within the New Testament church. He's not even being referred to as a minister. He's being referred to as a servant. Thinking about minister in the terms of an official kind of role that Paul put himself into as an evangelist minister, that he helped Timothy and nurtured and mentored Timothy into that role. Jesus here is being referred to as a servant in order to confirm the promises given to the patriarchs. We go back to Mark chapter 9. Mark chapter 9. If you don't leave here thinking anything else tonight, you'll leave here thinking, boy, if he just put all these on the PowerPoint, this would have been a whole lot easier. Technology is a wonderful thing. So are printed Bibles. Mark chapter 9 and verse 35, Jesus sits down and he calls the 12, and he says, if anyone would be first, he must be last and servant of all. So if you want to be first in the New Testament church, you need to be a deacon. That's not what he's saying. Well, that's the word. So if you want to be first in New Testament Christianity, then you need to be appointed to the role of a deacon. No, you need to be a servant. Just like all of us need to be servants. Matthew chapter 20, the word's used there in contrast to the Gentiles who lord it over. You be a servant, for the Son of Man came to be a servant. Not a deacon. We wouldn't even dare think about translating that word in those contexts as deacon, but yet it is the same word. And so we've got to look through the context and understand what is being taught or what is being expressed here in order to translate it. Maybe it should be translated minister. Maybe it's translated sometimes when it should be translated as a co-worker or a minister, with that specific role in mind, not just a servant, but a servant with a specific responsibility within the local congregation. And thus what I'm trying to do is begin to help you see that as a deacon, there is a spiritual leadership and guidance here, that this man is a servant. That's what he is, because that's what we all are, or supposed to be. But he is a servant within the local church in a specific area or work or direction or oversight of a specific group, age group, working group, benevolent group, mission group, whatever the case might be. He is a servant, absolutely. But in a specific role, if you will. 1 Corinthians 3. I don't know how many of these we need to do for you to get the point. I'm sure you've already got it. 1 Corinthians 3 and verse 5. 1 Corinthians 3 and verse 5. What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Now he's about to say, I planted, Apollos watered, God gave the increase. That's verse 6. Before he gets there, he's at, what is Apollos? What is Paul? Let me give you the answer. They are servants through whom you believed. Again, there's our word. But we wouldn't call Paul or Apollos deacons. We would simply call them servants. Or we might go back to our term that we could use for Timothy as ministers. So we have a couple of varieties there. But then I do believe that we find within the New Testament, and you could go to other passages like John 12 and verse 26, Romans 13 and verse 4, John 2 and verse 5. John 2 and verse 5, Jesus' mother says, tell the servants to do what He commands. That was when they were at the wedding feast in Canaan. And they had ran out of wine. And Jesus says, you know, go down and get the barrels of water and bring them up here. It'll all be all right. And His mother says, you tell the servants, they're not deacons. They're not ministers. They're just workers at this wedding feast. But they're servants. And thus, there's our word. And she says, you tell the servants to do, to listen, to go, get as He commands. And so there are many, many, many references. That's just a few. If you do a word search for the word servant, hundreds of times within the New Testament. But then I also think, and as we prepare to close the night, let's go to Philippians chapter 1. Johnny mentioned this one in our elders and deacons preacher meeting Monday evening, as using this as an encouragement, if you will, as a pointing out that it does appear, in fact, as Johnny said Monday night, that the church at Philippi was fairly a mature church, had been established for a while, and seems to have men of spiritual qualities that God desires. And so look at verse 1. Paul and Timothy, servants. Now, the word here is actually the word for slave. So you have two different words that are translated servant, slave in the New Testament. This is actually probably more commonly referred to or translated slave. But here, as it can be translated servants. But this is not the word for deacon. Servants of Jesus Christ, to all the saints in Christ Jesus who are at Philippi, notice the greeting here, with the overseers and deacons. So it appears, and again, this last word in this verse is diakonos. It's the word we've looked at in every one of the verses prior to this one. So why does the English here get translated instead of servants? They didn't choose that word. They chose that word for doulos, which is the word for slave in the beginning of the verse. They didn't choose the word ministers, although it can mean that, 1 Thessalonians 3 and verse 2. They chose the word deacon. And I believe rightfully so, because as it appears in the New Testament, while there is a vague meaning of servant, and vague, by vague I mean broad, and then there is a more specific meaning of that word, and that of minister, an evangelist, one who tells the good news of the gospel in a specific role within the local church or as a missionary traveling, as Paul and Barnabas and Silas and Timothy and other guys. And then thirdly, there appears to be a specific reference and meaning here in Philippians chapter 1 and verse 1 to that of deacon, a servant within the local church that is appointed into a position of leadership for a specific work or area. And so as you study your Bible and you find this word, it's important that, and thanks to some great scholars, we have a little bit done for us here because it is translated differently. And thus, I do believe rightfully so, although I do realize that there could have been mistakes made. But it appears to me that the right rendering here, because Paul has in mind the leadership of the church at Philippi. And he calls them overseers, bishops, elders, and deacons. To close tonight, we go back to 1 Timothy chapter 3. Just as a way of reminder, here again, verse 8 says deacons. And here again, it's the same word. But it does appear, based upon as we read and study 1 Timothy chapter 3, that Paul has more than just servants in mind here. Now, there are some qualities in all of this that is good for all of us. I may never serve as an elder in the Lord's church, but to be sober-minded and to be self-controlled and to be respectable are things that I ought to be striving to do every day of my life as a servant of Jesus Christ. Now, I realize, according to verse 2, in order for me to serve as an elder, then I must not only embody those things, I must be a great example and influence and leader in those things. I must have excelled in those areas. But just as a servant, God is calling all of us to live lives of self-control. And to be the same way when I drop down to verse 8 and we start with deacons. Likewise, to be dignified and not double-tongued and not addicted to much wine and not greedy for dishonest gain. To hold the mystery of faith with a clear conscience. To be tested and then serve, there's the word again, as deacons. Again, they didn't translate it servant. Could have. Didn't translate it minister. Could have. Or co-worker of God. But chose to translate this word because I believe in this context it is being used in an official capacity of leadership. Much like an overseer in the first 7 verses there. And we learn, verse 12, there are the physical qualities of this gentleman in terms of marriage, in terms of children, in terms of leading and managing as a steward of his own household. And then verse 13. I love verse 13. What do deacons do? Isn't that a wonderful question? What do deacons do? Okay, they're not errand boys, to use David Shannon's words. They're not gophers, to use my own word. Glorified servants? Really? I kind of think servanthood is all about glorifying God. So if you've referred to deacons as glorified servants, I would be very, very, very careful with that. Because it almost sounds like you're glorifying Him when we're all supposed to be glorifying God. So what do deacons do? What are they? Who are they? We know based on these things from verses 8 through 12, with the exception of verse 11, which seems like to be pointed to their wives, maybe elders and deacons' wives for that matter, but certainly in the paragraph about deacons, notice verse 13. They serve. What do deacons do? They serve. How do they serve? Notice verse 13. They serve well. They serve well. For what purpose? That they might gain a good standing for themselves and great confidence in the faith. Here's what I know. I know that in the very generic sense of the term, we're all servants. We're all supposed to be. God has called us all to be servants. I know that in some capacities, there are some of us that serve as ministers, that serve as public proclaimers of the good news or the message of Christ, if you will, following the footsteps of Peter and Paul and guys like that. And then I know that within the New Testament church, there are men, according to 1 Timothy 3, that embody these qualities that God desires that are appointed, it appears, from within, as Acts chapter 6 points out, and we've already pointed out. We are commanded to search out among us for these type of men, 1 Timothy 3, that we might be able to set over a particular area of service, that they might serve well in order to be in a good standing with great confidence. And here's what I know. I know that in a family, there are a lot of needs. I have a family. I have a family with 3 dependents. I can tell you that life was a lot easier when I only had 1 dependent. Life was a lot easier before Chastity and I had children, because she could take care of herself. And with more, you see, my point is, with a family comes responsibilities, comes duties, comes obligations, comes areas for greater needs. It's just a natural physical thing. It's also a natural spiritual thing. With a spiritual family, there are needs. There are needs within the family. There are needs within the property. There are needs within the community. And as the family grows, so grows the needs. It's just like when I had 1 child versus having 3 children. As the spiritual family grows, the needs grow. And so there are areas where oversight is needed. And men of God that are willing to stand up to the fire and be tested and be proven and show themselves trustworthy, honest, men of integrity, servants who desire to lead, to help, to be there, to watch out for this particular area, so that the body as a whole, the family as a whole, is able to function. And oftentimes it is the little things. But my friends, don't demise the little things. Because it's the little things all working together that makes the body function to its fullest capacity. When the little things go undone, the body suffers. And so while you and I may not think it's important, just get somebody. Just get anybody. I said from way back yonder when we started this, we're not looking for anybody. God's looking for somebody that's willing to step up and fill this role that seems to me in the New Testament to be a specific role of servanthood. And absolutely, at the end of the day, deacons are servants. And so too better we be. Either serving with them, serving in under their leadership, serving alongside of them, serving as an encouragement to them, or stepping up to serve as one of them. We must all be servants. And when called upon to a specific work, be ready and willing with the Lord's help, so that we might, hear verse 13 again, have a good standing. You know, I want all of our deacons to be in a good standing. I want all of us to be in a good stand, don't you? And to have a great confidence in the faith. I want all of our deacons to be men of great confidence in the faith. But you know what? I really want all of us to be. To have great confidence in our spiritual lives. And so as you read this week about deacons and what it is that those devotional thoughts will lead you and guide you to think about these men who it appears were appointed in the New Testament. And it does appear that God has a desire, as He gave Timothy the instructions, if you will, to continue to appoint these men. All for one purpose, that the body might function to its fullest capacity. Because here's what happens. When the body's not functioning, people are perishing. Let me repeat that. When the body's not functioning, people are perishing. And not all of them are out there. Some of them are in here. Some of them are us that are perishing because something's going undone. Because some work is not being cared for and seen after. Because the little things are being overlooked or demised to the point that, well, who wants to do that? I won't nobody appreciate me if I do that. And so we just leave the little things and people perish. Souls die. People are lost. The community's not reached. The community's not impacted. The brethren are not encouraged, unified, strengthened. When the body doesn't function properly, people perish. And so tonight, as we sing, rescue the perishing. That's what we're all about. Rescuing the perishing. We're trying to do that the best way God has set forth for us to do it. And in my mind, the more godly men to oversee this congregation and the more godly men to serve as deacons, the better off this body is. Based on what God has set forth as His desire for men who would step up and lead in this capacity. And when all of that works together, wow, possibilities are endless. Because all we're doing is planting and watering. I don't care how many elders we got or how many deacons we got or don't got. God's the one that gives the increase, and He always will be. And so as we serve, our desire is to rescue the perishing. If you're perishing tonight, we're throwing out the life ring. We're trying to pull you in. We want to be a family where you have security and safety, but we want to be a family that is offering first and foremost salvation. We're throwing out the life ring. Are you perishing? Would you let us help you? Would you let the Lord help you? Would you come tonight as we stand and sing?